Disclaimer. The events described in this video are based on a combination of declassified government documents, eyewitness testimonies, and long-standing conspiracy theories. While some facts surrounding the Philadelphia experiment have been verified, many aspects of the story remain controversial and unproven. The U.S. Navy has consistently denied any involvement in such an experiment, and no concrete evidence has ever been produced to support the more fantastical claims. This video is intended to explore the mystery and the theories surrounding the event, and does not claim to present definitive proof of the events described. All opinions and interpretations are based on publicly available information, and the goal is to spark curiosity and conversation about one of the most enduring and baffling mysteries in modern history. Viewer discretion is advised. Some content may be unsettling.
Morning in the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, or so it seemed. Sailors went about their duties. Engineers scribbled on clipboards. And at Pier 4, a newly commissioned destroyer escort, the USS Eldridge, floated silently, awaiting its next assignment. But then, something happened. A strange greenish-blue mist enveloped the ship. Witnesses claimed they saw it shimmer, like heat rising off pavement. Then, in an instant, it vanished. Not just from view, from existence. No radar, no trace. The Eldridge, they said, had disappeared from Philadelphia and reappeared, hundreds of miles away, in Norfolk, Virginia. Only seconds later, it was back again in Philadelphia, as if it had never left. Except it had. And the crew. They weren't the same. Some were disoriented. Others were burned. A few, it said, were embedded in the steel of the ship itself, fused into bulkheads, screaming. What happened that day in October 1943 has remained one of the most disturbing and persistent mysteries in modern history. Was it a government experiment gone horribly wrong? A successful test of teleportation, invisibility, or something even more bizarre, a manipulation of space and time? The U.S. Navy has always denied it, but the whispers never stopped. Strange letters, disappearing documents, testimonies from men who seemed broken by something they couldn't explain. Some say it's the greatest hoax of World War II. Others believe it opened a door we were never meant to touch. This is the story of the Philadelphia experiment, a tale of science, secrecy, and something far stranger than fiction. Because if it really happened, it means reality can break. World War II wasn't just a battle of bullets and bombs. It was a war of technology, and whichever side outpaced the other in innovation would decide the fate of the world. By 1943, the oceans were death traps. German U-boats lurked in the Atlantic, sinking Allied ships with terrifying efficiency. The U.S. Navy was desperate. They needed a way to protect their vessels, something beyond armor or firepower. They turned to science. In particular, the emerging fields of electromagnetism, radar invisibility, and theoretical physics. Frontiers that just a few years earlier had seemed like the realm of science fiction. One line of thinking was deceptively simple. If German submarines used magnetic torpedoes to target ships, what if a ship could somehow be demagnetized, rendered invisible to those torpedoes? This wasn't entirely theoretical. The Navy had already implemented degaussing techniques, using large electric cables around hulls to cancel out a ship's magnetic field. It helped, but it wasn't enough. The Navy wanted more. They wanted true invisibility. This is where the story begins to blur between documented history and whispered legend. Rumors spread that the Navy had turned to brilliant and unconventional minds. Some pointed to Nikola Tesla, the eccentric inventor who had once dazzled the world with wireless electricity and dreams of death rays. Though he had died earlier that year, some claimed his research lived on in secret government vaults. Others mentioned Albert Einstein. In 1928, Einstein introduced a concept called the unified field theory, a bold, incomplete attempt to link gravity and electromagnetism under one framework. He never finished it. But some believe that wartime scientists, working in the shadows, picked up where he left off, exploring whether powerful electromagnetic fields could bend space itself. The theory was staggering. If gravity could be manipulated, so could time. And if electromagnetism and light were linked, then maybe, just maybe, it was possible to bend light around an object. The implications were terrifying and exhilarating. This wasn't just about hiding ships from sonar. This was about making a ship vanish, from sight, from radar, from reality. Secret projects like Manhattan and Teasard had already proven that science could turn the tide of war. But those were carefully documented, staffed by thousands, backed by billions. This was different. According to later testimonies, the project, whatever it truly was, operated in near total secrecy. Small teams, isolated labs, no official paper trail, and above all, total deniability. But why take such a risk? Because war accelerates everything. Morality becomes fluid. Boundaries between right and wrong, real and imagined, begin to dissolve. The Navy needed a miracle, and some believe they got one. On a foggy autumn day in 1943, they would test that miracle on the USS Eldridge. And the result, some say, wasn't just scientific. It was otherworldly. October 28, 1943. The Philadelphia Naval Shipyard was shrouded in mist. The USS Eldridge, a newly commissioned cannon-class destroyer escort, sat silently in the harbor. She was built for one purpose: to guard Allied convoys against German U-boats. But on this day, she was the centerpiece of something else, something not listed on any public record. What happened next is one of the most controversial and chilling events in military history. According to declassified documents, the Eldridge was undergoing a routine test. But eyewitnesses, and there are more than a few, tell a different story. A buzzing hum filled the air. Strange equipment had been installed on board: high-frequency generators, massive Tesla coils, miles of electromagnetic cabling. Civilian technicians and uniformed men stood watching nervously from the dock. Then came a flash. A blinding green-blue glow surrounded the ship. The water around the hull began to boil. A strange, high-pitched vibration made the air itself feel thick. And then, in an instant, the ship was gone. Not just from view, from existence. Dock workers ran for cover. Some swore they felt a pressure wave, like the air being torn open. Others reported brief nausea, confusion, or even missing time. But when they looked back, the USS Eldridge had vanished into thin air. Now here's where it gets even stranger. Roughly 200 miles south, in Norfolk, Virginia, a ship matching the Eldridge's description appeared briefly in the harbor, reportedly out of nowhere. Men on the docks screamed as the vessel flickered into visibility, stayed for mere minutes, and then vanished again. And then, just as suddenly as it had disappeared, the Eldridge returned to Philadelphia. But something was wrong. Very wrong. Crew members staggered off the ship, dazed and terrified. Some were missing, others were rambling incoherently. Several reportedly vomited uncontrollably or collapsed, screaming about never-ending time and the inside out. And then came the most horrific claims of all. Some sailors were found fused to the metal bulkheads, their limbs and torsos partially embedded in the steel deck, as if they had been molten into the ship itself. Others had burn marks, radiation-like symptoms, or strange scars that defied medical explanation. One man supposedly walked through a wall in front of a witness and never came back. A few went completely catatonic. Others suffered mental breakdowns in the days that followed, unable to speak or sleep, haunted by visions no one could explain. In the weeks that followed, the Navy quietly reassigned the remaining crew. Many were discharged with vague psychological diagnoses. Some disappeared entirely. No official record of the incident, or the experiment, was ever released. The event faded into obscurity. Until 1955, when Carlos Allende, later known as Carl Allen, a drifter with a sharp memory and a strange past, sent a series of letters to author and astronomer Morris K. Jessup, claiming to know what really happened to the USS Eldridge. According to Allende, the experiment had been an attempt to bend light and radar waves, but it had accidentally breached the fabric of space-time. The ship had been teleported, not just in location, but in time. Jessup was fascinated and disturbed. When he later died under mysterious circumstances, the rumors only deepened. The Navy has always denied that such an experiment ever took place. They claim the Eldridge was never in Philadelphia on that date, and certainly never teleported. But multiple witnesses, multiple sightings, and multiple lives destroyed. What then did happen on that day in 1943? And if the USS Eldridge was truly the subject of a top-secret experiment, what kind of power were they really trying to unleash? When the USS Eldridge reappeared in Philadelphia, it was as if the air itself snapped back into place, like reality correcting a glitch. But what came back was not the same as what had vanished. The ship's hull was intact, but her crew was not. According to whispers from dock workers and leaked naval correspondence, the scene on board was nothing short of a nightmare. Some men were standing motionless, eyes wide, murmuring to themselves. Others writhed on the deck, clutching their heads, screaming about being trapped in the dark. A few stumbled out, clothes smoldering, skin burned in strange swirling patterns, not like from fire, but something else, like radiation or energy exposure. And then there were those the witnesses could never forget. Several sailors were found embedded in the ship's structure, fused into walls, decks, and bulkheads as if they'd been phased into solid matter. Arms protruding from steel, legs half swallowed by the floor. One man, according to rumor, had only his torso visible, eyes blinking, mouth moving, until he died minutes later from shock. Others were simply missing, gone without a trace. In the days that followed, the remaining crew began to unravel. Some slipped into catatonia. Others developed violent delusions. One sailor reportedly vanished through a wall in front of his wife during a visit, never to return. Another kept waking in the night, screaming about being stuck between seconds. The Navy issued no official statement. Medical personnel were silenced. Families received conflicting reports: routine discharge, psychological instability, non-combat injury. Some received nothing at all. But the whispers spread. Was this teleportation? Or something darker? Some theorists claimed the experiment had created a space-time displacement, that the ship had not only moved through space, but briefly exited our dimension entirely, that it had passed through some invisible veil, and what came back was scarred by the journey. There were even stranger claims, that crew members aged prematurely, that they could disappear and reappear at will, sometimes uncontrollably, that some phased out of existence years later, their atoms never fully settled. The most infamous claims came from supposed survivors, or people who knew them. One alleged sailor, interviewed in the 1960s, insisted he had spent what felt like hours in a black void during the experiment. There were others there, he whispered. They were watching. Despite growing rumors and mounting inconsistencies, the U.S. Navy held firm. Nothing happened. No experiment, no disappearance, no anomalies. In 1946, the USS Eldridge was decommissioned. Rather than scrapping her, she was quietly transferred to Greece under a military aid program. Renamed the Leon, she served in the Hellenic Navy until the 1990s, where her history was rewritten, her logs sanitized, and her past buried. But for those who believe, that transfer was no coincidence. It was a burial at sea, not of a ship, but of truth. Because what came back in 1943 wasn't just a destroyer escort. It was evidence that something unnatural had happened, and someone wanted to make sure it never happened again. What happened aboard the USS Eldridge left behind more than rumors and wrecked machinery. It left behind people, broken, confused, and terrified. Over the decades, individuals claiming to be survivors or witnesses of the Philadelphia experiment began to surface. Some offered detailed accounts, others just fragments, haunting memories, strange physical symptoms, or inexplicable mental disturbances. One alleged sailor described missing time, hours, even days, where he could remember nothing but a sensation of floating. Another claimed he found objects in his pockets he couldn't recognize, along with a wristwatch that was suddenly running backward. A few told stories of waking up in unfamiliar places, disoriented, unable to recall how they got there. Then came the hallucinations, visions of walls rippling, of voices whispering in static, of lights in places they shouldn't be. One man said he saw his shipmates shimmer out of focus, like heat on asphalt, even weeks after the incident. Others described a recurring feeling of being out of phase, like reality didn't fully fit anymore. These were not just stories. Medical reports, sparse but real, revealed cases of psychosis, catatonia, and rapid onset amnesia among Navy personnel during that period. The Navy chalked it up to battle fatigue or psychological stress. But the timing and concentration of cases around the Eldridge stirred suspicion. Supporters of the Philadelphia experiment theory argue this was the aftershock of a botched technology, an experiment in electromagnetic field manipulation that affected not just the ship, but the minds of the men on board. But skeptics offer a simpler explanation. Trauma. The 1940s were a time of crude medical understanding. LSD was in its infancy. PTSD wasn't even a clinical term yet. If an accident, electrical, chemical, or experimental, had occurred, it could easily have triggered hallucinations, dissociation, or mass psychogenic illness. Add to that the high stress of war, and the lines between truth and delusion blur quickly. Others suggest something even more strategic: disinformation. Could the government, or elements within it, have seeded fantastical stories to cover up real, but less paranormal experiments? Perhaps the Eldridge was part of a classified radar cloaking or degaussing test, and the rumors of teleportation were encouraged to discredit or confuse potential leaks. It wouldn't be the first time bizarre conspiracy was used as a smokescreen for a military secret. Consider this: in the 1950s, UFO reports skyrocketed around Air Force test sites. Coincidence? Or camouflage? In the case of the Eldridge, the more outrageous the claim, sailors melting into walls, teleporting across states, the less believable the entire story becomes. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the truth was stranger than fiction, but the fiction was safer. Ultimately, the testimonies, real or fabricated, share a common thread. Something happened. Whether it was a failed experiment, a psychological trauma, or a deliberate myth engineered to cloak the truth, the lingering echoes of the Philadelphia experiment continue to haunt our imagination. Because whether those men witnessed a breach in space-time, or just the breach of their own sanity, the scars never fully disappeared. The U.S. Navy has never wavered in its stance. The Philadelphia experiment never happened. According to official statements, there is no record of any such event. No evidence that the USS Eldridge was in Philadelphia on October 28, 1943. And no technology ever existed, then or now, capable of rendering a warship invisible, much less teleporting it across hundreds of miles. Simple. Clean. Denial complete. But for many, that explanation raises more questions than it answers. Take the ship's logs, for instance. The Eldridge's movement records have been cited by skeptics to prove the story false. Yet those logs were declassified decades after the fact, by which time they could have been altered or reconstructed. Even if accurate, some researchers believe the Eldridge could have passed through Philadelphia covertly before being assigned to convoy duty in the Atlantic. Then there's the matter of Project Rainbow, a little-known initiative referenced in obscure military documents and whistleblower accounts. Some theorists argue Project Rainbow was the true name of the Philadelphia experiment, later buried under unrelated files to obscure its real objective: radar invisibility. Here's where things get interesting. Radar stealth was a genuine military priority during World War II. The U.S. and its allies were actively testing magnetic field manipulation, degaussing coils, and advanced camouflage to confuse enemy detection systems. These experiments involved heavy electrical equipment, field distortions, and potentially dangerous side effects. So could it be that the Philadelphia experiment was based on a real test, but warped over time into something more dramatic? Declassified files have revealed the existence of other ethically dubious military experiments during the Cold War, from radioactive exposure to psychological testing. In that context, the idea of an unauthorized electromagnetic experiment doesn't sound so far-fetched. But then, how did the story go from a technical trial to teleportation? Blame it on Carlos Allende, also known as Carl Allen, the original source of the tale. In the 1950s, Allende sent letters to UFO researcher Morris K. Jessup, claiming first-hand knowledge of the Eldridge's disappearance. His claims were strange, erratic, and difficult to verify, but they struck a chord in an era obsessed with flying saucers, government secrecy, and Cold War paranoia. The legend took on a life of its own. It entered pop culture, spawning books, documentaries, and the 1984 sci-fi movie The Philadelphia Experiment, which cemented the idea of a ship trapped in time, its crew doomed to flicker between dimensions. From there, the story evolved into a full-blown conspiracy, a perfect storm of fact, fiction, and fear. And like all great conspiracies, it endures because it can't be fully disproven. Yes, science tells us that teleportation on that scale is impossible. Yes, the Navy denies everything, but we've seen enough secrets revealed, from MK Ultra to surveillance programs, to know that truth and transparency don't always go hand in hand. So was the Philadelphia experiment real? Or was it an illusion, a cautionary tale born from Cold War fear and human imagination? The answer may lie buried in classified files, lost testimony, or perhaps, like the Eldridge itself, briefly visible before vanishing again into history. In the end, the Philadelphia experiment lives in the uneasy space between myth and memory, a story too strange to be true, and yet too persistent to dismiss. We know the facts. The USS Eldridge was a real ship. The Navy did experiment with magnetic field manipulation. Science was advancing rapidly, often recklessly, and Cold War secrecy blanketed nearly every corner of military innovation. But we also know how stories grow, how trauma can blur into rumor, how whispers become warnings, and how human minds fill in the blanks when official answers never come. Maybe it was all a misunderstanding. Maybe it was psychological trauma misread as something supernatural. Or maybe, just maybe, something happened in Philadelphia that day. Something no one was supposed to see. Not the crew, not the public, not history. Was it teleportation? A scientific miracle gone wrong? Or the invention of a lonely man, misunderstood and magnified by fear? We may never know. Because the deeper you go into the Philadelphia experiment, the more it feels like chasing shadows in fog. Real, but always just out of reach. And perhaps that's the most haunting part. Not knowing if the lie was too strange to believe, or the truth too dangerous to tell.